Welcome to the Media Storm studio. Joining us now are two very special guests.
Our first guest is an entrepreneur and the founder of Dope Black Dads, a digital safe space for fathers who wish to discuss their experiences of being black, a parent, and masculinity in the modern world. He is also the author of Dope Black Dads, Life Lessons on Fatherhood. Welcome to the studio, Marvyn Harrison.
Thank you. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our second guest is the co-founder of Nugget, a financial community for new parents. Their goal is to completely transform maternity and paternity pay for the better and help new or future parents understand and plan parental leave policies. Welcome to the studio, Katie Guild.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Right, let's start with you, Marvyn. What are the current paternity leave laws in the UK?
Well, the current paternity leave entitles eligible employees to 1 or 2 consecutive weeks of paid leave within the first 56 days of a child's birth or adoption. This is paid at currently at £184.03 a week, or 90% of the employee's average weekly earnings, if lower. And that's the really hard part. So if it's actually, whichever one is lower is the one that is accepted. So if you earn less, there's no chance to earn more. And then some employers offer obviously enhanced paternity pay, but this is legally not required.
So sorry, did you say 1 to 2 weeks?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to establish that.
1 to 2 weeks at less than £200 a week.
Yes, which is less than minimum wage.
That's basically, not paid leave.
It's less
Basically.
than half of minimum wage.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry that my German husband moved to the UK.
Yeah, he's going to be screwed. Did you take your full paternity leave of 2 weeks?
No, so I didn't even bother to apply because at that rate, it's less than a day's worth of money than I was earning a week, and so I just went back to work. So when I was calculating, at first I thought we might be able to navigate it, and I was trying to save. But because it's a new baby, we were moving into a new house. There was so much cost and expenditure that actually when it came down to just doing the paperwork, the mental gymnastics of the paperwork, I just chose to go back to work to cover the costs because it wasn't going to scratch the surface in what we needed related to the amount of time that it was going to take for me to fill this thing in. And so I did a week off, and then I did a day of the second week. And then I literally remember that night just sitting there panicking and just being like, I'm going to go back to work. And I called my mum, her mum, my sister, and said, could you please just rotate being here so that I can just go back to work and just make it easier?
How did that feel, leaving your newborn baby every day in the morning?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of men are like, I just want to get out of here. I was the absolute opposite. I was like, how do I get deeper, more involved, more useful, more connected? And so my mission to be super present was just being impacted with the stress of expense. And it's part expense, but there was also this sort of experience that I was having around what role do I play here? Those two questions left me on a slight outside of the kind of parenting journey. And there was so little information, insights to how to best navigate it that it only by creating my own community and my own space did it make any sense that I started to get a bit of insight as to what men were actually doing and basically just running at a deficit. There was no answer that, it's not like money saving expert. There was a tip that could help you with your pensions. It was nothing. It was basically just, we'll empathize with you here, but go back out in the world and kind of figure it out, and you need to make more money and save more money.
And we'll definitely be delving a bit more into fatherhood and those kind of roles and how paternity leave plays into all of that in a moment. But Katie, let's bring you in here. Can you try and help us to understand some of the current maternity leave laws in the UK?
So for statutory maternity pay, you need to be employed by your employer 41 weeks before your due date, which means you can't be pregnant when you start the job to be eligible for statutory maternity pay. And then what you get paid is 6 weeks at 90% of your average wage, or £184.03, whichever is higher for those first 6 weeks. And then for the next 33 weeks, it switches. So it's £184.03, or 90% of your average weekly wage, whichever is lower. And then if you're not eligible for statutory maternity pay, so say you did start the job whilst you were pregnant, then you might be eligible for maternity allowance instead, which is slightly different. I've explained that when we're talking about self-employed parents. But in the UK, 2/3 of employers offer some sort of enhancement for maternity pay, so some sort of payment above statutory maternity pay.
So it's 6 weeks on a livable amount? 6
Yes.
weeks?
Yeah.
I thought it would be like 6 months. Honestly, I mean, I'm coming at this from a total position of ignorance. Those both seem abysmally low.
It's half of national minimum wage. It is very difficult. 26% of women fall into debt over their maternity leave. So it's very hard to survive on that amount of money, particularly when you've got all the new costs coming in. You might have bought a new house, as we mentioned, or you've got lots of baby classes that you want to do, all the things that you've bought for a baby, just surviving. For most people, it doesn't cover their rent, let alone all the other bills on top of that.
Yeah, the term leave sort of implies it's a time, a
holiday.
a peaceful time, or an
Yes.
opportunity for you to bond with your baby. But being so strapped like that, how was maternity leave for you?
So I was self-employed. I had a nightwear brand at the time, but I also had a part-time job. So I was lucky in the sense that I was able to claim statutory maternity pay and still work on my business. Lucky. Depends how you look at it, I guess.
And raise a baby.
And raise a baby. I fully intended to take some time off with my business and take some time with my baby. I'd hired somebody. It was just after the pandemic, so I was selling pyjamas, so it was great during the pandemic. But then it sort of came to an e-commerce crash. I don't know if you remember, in like 2022. People went back out into the world and started living their lives again and getting out of their pyjamas. So, like, my favourite phrase is businesses don't wait for babies. And when your business starts to take a dip, I didn't really have a choice apart from leap back into the business. So I was working from hospital. My baby was in NICU for the first couple of days of his life. And I was sending emails to my ads team. And I didn't really have a maternity leave in the traditional sense, which really, I felt the effects of mentally for a very long time after that. And eventually, that led to all sorts of things like delayed postpartum depression. And it made me realise how financially unprepared I was. And I think I just was really naive. The UK is the 6th richest nation in the world. So you go in with that expectation that we have some sort of vaguely good parental leave pay. And it's just not the case.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. So how does the UK's paternity leave compare with other countries?
So in Sweden, you get 16 months paid leave, which is obviously fantastic in comparison.
16 months paid paternity leave?
Yes.
Wow.
And then in Germany, parents have 14-month paid leave, covering 67% of earnings. And in France, the maternity leave is 16% longer for multiple births as well. It does include multiple births, which is super important, with 100% salary paid by Social Security. And obviously, like in countries like the US, there are none. So having the worst paternity leave in Europe is not a great standing. And I think the promise of us leaving Europe, for example, and us being able to create our own laws and our own rules, it hasn't necessarily boded very well, particularly for men who, from all intents and purposes, we created this system, we benefit the most from this system, but we haven't considered what that does for us and our families, which is probably the biggest crime. And as that continues, it just means that the load is not just heavier on mothers, but it also means dads are completely estranged from their children, because the economic choice will always lead for the man to go back to work faster, on the majority of times, men to go back to work faster to provide. And I think that's a massive part of the broken system that we have at the moment.
Yeah. And maternity leave, I mean, we've just had paternity leave is the worst in Europe. Let that linger. Where are we with maternity leave?
So we have quite a long maternity leave, which is where I think people get a bit confused and think that it's good, because we've got a year off that you can take. 3 months of those are unpaid, 39 of those are paid, even though paid very abysmally. But the rate of pay, when you compare it to the OECD, is one of the lowest. So even though places like France have shorter maternity leave, I think it's about 4 months in France, they're getting paid a much higher percentage of their salary. So even when you spread it across the time, our rate of pay is very low. which is the problem. And I think lots of people always bring up America to us whenever we do videos on TikTok or Instagram about how low our pay is, and the argument is always, we should be grateful that you're getting paid at all. And I think it's really important
because America doesn't
because of
do anything.
America. And I think it's important to remember America is one of 7 countries out of over 190 that don't pay maternity pay by the government. So I don't know why there's an obsession to focus on the very minimum and the people that are performing truly at the bottom of the table. It's not a good benchmark, and I don't think we should focus on it.
And, you know, what do the US and UK have in common, you know, that maybe separates us from Europe when it comes to family culture and welfare culture as opposed to work culture? It's just generally much worse. You know, the balance skews one way in for Europe and another way in the US and UK. So there is much more of a focus on work as the highest value, and much less focus on the importance of welfare and basic security for the majority, or if not everyone, in the population.
Definitely. And whenever we see our content go to America, the reaction is they just don't understand maternity leave at all. I mean, I don't even broach paternity leave. Their view on childcare is extremely different to ours. And it's such a huge mountain for them to climb. I think it's almost just too difficult to even start engaging with their conversations, to be honest. It's a completely different culture, as you say.
You mentioned also that you were self-employed. So I think it's very difficult to find accurate information about maternity leave if you're a freelancer or you're self-employed. So can you try and just help us out a little bit with that?
Yeah, please, God. We need that.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is super hard for self-employed parents. Self-employed dads get no paternity leave or pay at all. There's nothing there for them. And for mums, you can apply for maternity allowance. So you're missing the difference between SMP and maternity allowance is you miss the first 6 weeks at 90% of your average wage. So it's just a flat rate.
Right.
How much you get is dependent on how many Class 2 national insurance contributions you've made. So you can get a letter. There is many cases where people apply and they're self-employed. They get a letter through the post and it says you're allowed £27 a week. The maximum amount that you can get is £184.03 a week, which is the same as the statutory pay for paternity leave and adoption leave and statutory maternity pay. But the good news is if you do get that scary letter of £27, you can just call them and make up your Class 2 national insurance contributions to get that full rate of pay. And it's a difference of like 5 or 6 grand, so it's definitely worth doing. I think the total payment is about £50. So don't panic if you get that letter through the post. It is a bit unnecessary. I just feel like they should just say, here's what's missing, pay that, and then you'll get the full contribution. But the other bad thing about maternity allowance is that you can't work on your business. You get 10 kit days, which means you can work in your business and make money. But aside from that, you can't. Whilst you're on statutory maternity pay, you are actually allowed to do self-employed businesses. So that's why you see lots of women doing side hustles on their maternity leave. But you can't do that if you're self-employed, apart from those 10 days. Yes. So
That's wild.
It feels really restrictive.
I think we're starting to understand how much of it is not only anti-family but also anti-business. It's like we're not normally if you're anti-family you're like really pro-business, and it's like work on your business and contribute tax. We're really bad at both, and so I think that now that the kind of light is on this issue, it's a really good opportunity to start a much better conversation about what changes need to be made. And I think often when we think about parental leave, paternity leave, there's this sort of thing of like, well, what about mothers? And it's like trying to have a conversation about men's rights just for men to actually promote healthy male attitudes towards things like leave. It's not a mirror to, it does absolutely uplift and benefit mothers, which is absolutely great. But trying to say to men, like, pay attention to your own relationship, to your family, your children, your partner, it's for you. And I think because there isn't enough self-interest, sometimes the conversation kind of goes over the head of men, and we're not taking up the leave that we need to. We're not doing the things that we need to because we're just still not seeing ourselves in a lot of these policies.
Yeah, so research from March 2024 by the organisation Pregnant Then Screwed revealed that 3 in 5 fathers took 2 weeks or less paternity leave following the birth of their most recent child. And over 70% of fathers who only used part of their paternity leave entitlement revealed that it was because they couldn't afford to stay off any longer. Is this a main reason why some men would choose not to take their paternity leave, you think?
Yeah, look, there's a social stigma also, as in like you're just at home. It's like, oh, you're not really working, and it's almost like you're a sub man as a result of doing so. There's also a workplace stigma as well, because I think one of the big four accountancy firms, I don't want to name one of the companies just in case, but they got sued for ending somebody's contract after they took shared parental leave. And he directly correlates it to the fact that he asked to specifically take that time off.
What is shared parental leave? Just quickly.
So shared parental leave is that there's actually it's introduced in 2015, and it allows parents to share up to 50 weeks of leave, with 37 of that 50 weeks being paid between them.
So basically,
but
you can
uptakes
transfer
those.
some of your maternity leave
Yes.
to your partner.
So as a couple, we could say of that I want to do 25, I could do 30. We can actually split it, and so your job is protected, but only 37 of those 50 weeks are actually paid. But the uptake is still very, very low. It's actually less than 2%, around about the 2% mark of people are uptaking this.
Right, but presumably a factor in that is that men tend to make more. We have a gender pay gap.
It immediately reverts back to that inequality, and the house just needing money, and most people just dividing that labor based on money. And I think that's a part of the attitudinal shift that needs to happen for dads, where we look at the issue from about our own connection. This is why I always speak specifically that it's about men's connection to their children, not just about money and, entrepreneurship and all those other things. When we look at men in their 60s and why they're experiencing loneliness and isolation, why families break down, why their children don't come and visit them, it's because of their overall disconnect at really important times. They don't know their children. And so then as a result, we're seeing men dying early. That's why things like suicide is higher for men. There's so many societal things that feed into it. And I'm really trying to raise the alarm to men about their self-interest, which serves family, rather than just like look after your family, which every man has kind of been programmed with from the beginning anyway, and it's not working.
Should paternity leave be mandatory? I mean, you've just mentioned all these really, really relevant social issues, men's mental health issues, isolation. These come up in so many of the stories that we cover at Media Storm. If a lot of this is to do with connection and family and better work-life balance and less pressure on men to be the sole provider, is paternity leave a way to do that? And if so, should paternity leave be mandatory?
In an ideal world, it will become mandatory, but we have to look at the context in which we'll be forcing men to stay at home in. If they're not actually equipped emotionally to be a net positive in the house, that actually can wreak havoc on families in a different way. And so if you put men in an environment where they've never been allowed to feel first and to be emotionally present and try and set their frequency for their children, their partner, for their home, if they've never done that, all they would do is just be there and potentially be of problem. So we have to make sure we're awakening their own ideas of themselves and what kind of person needs to be at home and what they can do. As I said, I was deeply passionate about being at home, but still found being there, felt like I was in the way and not particularly needed directly. And that created something for me where I had to go find community. Now, not every man is as resourceful as that. And many men would just sit in the house becoming a nuisance or a negative impact in the house, which is probably worse. Most people would agree. And so it's really important that we awaken men to understand what the actual challenge is and what they can create by being there in the right frame of mind.
So we need paternity leave, but we also need
We need a
cultural
society.
shift.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because we need that cultural shift, because what is springing to my mind right now is like there's a really common thing where women say about their male partners like, oh, I've left the baby at home with him, he's babysitting. And it's like, he's not babysitting, like that's his child.
It's parenting, like literally. And look, I think that language, so sometimes when I used to get with my children, I would be the one that's at the park and people leaning in and being like, oh my God, I'm so happy that you're with your child. And it's like, where else would I be? Like this should be heavily normalized. And sometimes how we talk about it impacts how we all see the thing that's really obvious in our face. Like, it happens so wide and broad that people just don't expect me to be a present, active, loving father. They just assume that, like, I'm either being paid to be there or something unique is happening. But it's like, no, these are my children and I'm comfortable being here. There is nothing, I don't need any help. I know what I'm doing. And I think I want more men to be that confident in their ability to parent publicly as well.
Is that why you created Dope Black Dads? And can you tell us about making that space?
Yeah, look, I think I created it because I was stuck. It was such an emotional place. I couldn't sit there and be like, it was a strategy. There is no, it's not a brand, it's not a strategy. It's a space for me to speak into a place that has healthy-minded men in it. That when I say I'm struggling with something, or how much online time are you giving with your children, or what did you do for this particular challenge, I get useful, actionable information back. I get empathy back. I get insights back. That's a very rare space. Now, we know mothers have these spaces all the time. The kind of mothering WhatsApp group is definitely not new. But from a father's perspective, when we launched it in 2018, I wasn't invited into any space. I told everybody when I was having a child, the whole pregnancy period, when I had a child, a year happened in, and nobody has said, join this group, come to this meeting, speak to this person. And it was literally me just being like, what are my friends doing? Because this is a terrible experience. This is not what I envisioned. This is not what I saw on TV. This is not what I heard about fathering. So it became something that I wanted to keep alive for every man to be able to have a light touch support space to come in and ask really simple questions, get healthy answers, be curious, but also to try and keep families together. Like, it seems to be, there doesn't seem to be enough energy in focus in keeping families together. And the divorce rate, the separation rate, the parental alienation rate, all these things are increasing day on day, and nobody seems to be developing any form of answers, which is deeply worrying for me.
Katie, I'm wondering whether you agree and what your views are on paternity leave. You campaign for better maternity leave. Do you also campaign for better paternity leave? And do you think that could be really helpful for women, not just for economic inequality, but also for the reasons Marvyn's just associated with family and family security?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I was in the depths of maternity leave, and when we first started Nugget, I was very much like, this is about maternity pay and focusing on women. And I very quickly realised, after having exposure to groups like Pregnant and Screwed, and Inspiring Dads, and people like that, Fatherhood Institute, that actually it is a problem for a family to fix, and it's not just dads as well, it's other parents, other partners. And it is important about helping with the mental load, helping with equal parenting. And I think what Marvyn was saying about how at the beginning, of maternity leave, you've got a small baby. Actually, dads aren't that useful sometimes, and particularly if you're breastfeeding, you can feel a bit lost and you're like, what am I doing here? Shared parental leave could be great or paternity leave that you can take in different blocks, because dads can come into their own when the kids are a bit bigger, and that might actually work at the point where mums feel ready to go back to work anyway, and you can split it in different ways. But if you're not setting it up right, the other thing about shared parental leave is so confusing. HR teams don't understand it, employment lawyers don't understand it. We're doing a masterclass on it next week with an employment lawyer, because we don't really get all the intricacies and how it works. And when your employer doesn't understand either, when you go to them and say, how do I do this, it makes it very difficult for it to take practically.
It's kind of like if you decide to become a parent, you're slightly inconveniencing our capitalist society. You're just a bit of an inconvenience on the natural running order of things.
Yeah.
And also, I think every few months in the news cycle, we'll kind of see articles along the lines of the UK's birth rate has fallen and women aren't having children anymore. And financial reasons will always be given as one of the many possible reasons. But a lot of blame is often quite underlyingly placed on women being too independent to want children. Why do you think women aren't having children anymore? In inverted commas?
There is a real myriad of reasons, and we always really want to be careful and Nugget, and we believe it totally that women should have a choice to have babies, and there's the pro-natalist movement, which is very scary in a whole different way, and but having choice is really important. But the problem we've got is the people who want to make that choice feel like they can't because of finances, because of housing. So lots of people that we speak to in our community have one child, would love to have a sibling, but have just been financially decimated by their first maternity leave, or they've had really poor experiences, or they had terrible births, because let's not forget that maternity care in the UK is also at crisis point. And it's very difficult if there's no support system, which there isn't in the UK, around, dealing with the mental ramifications of having a really traumatic birth. Or there is support, but it's difficult to get hold of. And dads aren't, enabled to support. Employers often have a really poor attitude when you're returning from maternity leave. Like, new statistics came out from Pregnant and Screwed last week that 76,000 women, or 74,000 women a year, are fired or, have pushed out of their jobs as a result of pregnancy or maternity discrimination.
That's 74,000 women in the UK.
In the UK, and it's increased massively. I think the old statistic was 56,000 a couple of years ago. So it's getting worse. And in that environment, it doesn't feel like you're being rewarded. We talk a lot about the motherhood penalty, and it's something that we're really passionate about solving at Nugget, because currently your pension suffers when you have a child, your career suffers, you go through a really, you potentially take up a lot of debt. As I mentioned before, 26% of women get in debt on their mat leave. You go through a period of having really sustained low pay into then catastrophically high childcare costs. So you don't catch a break. Like, there's no chance to build up your wealth. And in that environment, are you then meant to save for baby number 2? Like, where is the money coming from? You just had no disposable income for a year, 2 years. And then you have to then go into and think about, am I going to take that shot on my career again and on my finances? And how long is it going to take me to get back into that place in my career? So there's so much that you have to take into consideration when you're having kids. And that sounds really depressing, right? That sounds like, why would you do it? So, we exist at Nugget to try and solve those problems right now, because it's no good sitting on our laurels and be like, let's just wait for the government, because government are making progress, but it takes forever, and it's always really small steps. So if you want kids now, there are time-limited prospects. They're not something that typically you can sit on for 20 years and wait, fingers crossed someone's going to come along and sort out childcare. So what are you going to do right now? For dads, there really isn't much advice that we can give, and it is really frustrating because there's not loads of loopholes. For maternity pay, there actually are a couple of things that you can do. There are rights that you have that you can make sure that you can stand on your business and make sure that you're not getting taken the mick out of by your employer. You can make sure that pension contributions are being made at the right rate. There are things that you can do to kind of mitigate those losses.
But you say that, there's rights that you have. You also told us, minutes ago, 74,000 women in the UK a year are losing their jobs for getting pregnant. I mean, isn't that discrimination? The study you mentioned, it also said that half of pregnant women on maternity leave, women straight back from maternity leave, they say they had a negative experience at work. However, just 2% of women who experience this kind of discrimination raise a tribunal claim. So, what are their rights, and why is there that massive gap?
I think you have to think about the context in which you're expected to go and have a tribunal. You've just had a baby. Your emotions are all over the place. You are in an economic position where you want a job to return to, because you've got you've just had a massive whack on your finances for all that time. You don't feel particularly confident potentially because you've been out of the workforce for maybe up to a year. Lots of people do take issue with their employer. Sometimes it's difficult to prove. It's he said, she said. But there's also pervasive use of NDAs. So we don't actually maybe know the true number of how many people are settling because of these kind of cases. And that's something that Pregnant and Screwed are working on. But yeah, you're in a very vulnerable position when you're pregnant and when you're on maternity leave. If you're experiencing pregnancy discrimination, you might want to just brush it under the carpet so that you can get some maternity pay, because otherwise you're without a job, pregnant, trying to get another job, trying to claim maternity allowance, trying to find a job and say to an employer, I'm actually not going to be here for the next 6 months to a year. It's a very tricky environment to stand up for yourself.
We don't see raising children as a social investment, apparently. We see it as a social burden.
Yeah, we hear it all the time, getting paid to stay at home, and like maybe colleagues feel like you're leaving them in the lurch and then someone has to pick up the slack, and you're just going off on a break, and there isn't kind of equating the economic importance of child rearing and how important that is as a society, and also how productive you are on maternity leave. Like looking after a baby is incredibly productive for society. You're raising the next customer, you're raising the next taxpayer, and you're raising the next worker. So it is incredibly productive use of time, but it's always framed as kind of some sort of holiday or just a break from conventional work, which it is, but we have to still, I think there's a job to reframe it as something that's very useful, and it's a work just of a different kind.
I want to dig into how the media covers these topics a little bit more. And I wonder, Marvyn, what are your experiences with the media? You've been kind of campaigning and talking about masculinity for a long time and talking about fatherhood. And I wonder, when you either, interviews that you've given or things in the media that you've seen, do you think the media are asking the right questions about paternity leave, about fatherhood?
I think there's been a welcome. I think this is the least confrontational topic I've taken into a media landscape at any point. I get more support for the idea of men being more active, present and loving. But when it comes down to the practical steps of actually bringing it into action, there's a lot of resistance. And the first question is, how do we pay for it all? Which is the first way to dismiss an actual claim of any form of equity. And a lot of the work I do is around race, gender, sexuality, parenting. And in that, there's this constant belief that everybody's scapegoating, everybody's in an avoidance of an accountability of being resilient, being useful to society. And I think if you then get platformed next to somebody who hasn't had children, has never had children, has never given birth, not actually present in their children, being quoted by Boris Johnson to me is just bizarre in a quest to look about parental equality. And that happens so often that it removes the authenticity. It removes actually the power for us to actually hold everybody accountable for what we need as parents. And you end up being platformed in this sort of debate and argument with people who should never be discussing what parents need anyway. And so when I talk about the media landscape, it's a incorrect platforming of the issue alongside people in things that don't make sense, and who also deeply reject any form of idea of equality. They just see it as all this one big lack of accountability from people who want ease, like women just want it easy or men want to stay at home, and the language that you mentioned earlier. And it's some of the most frustrating things to be on there and having to explain that actually this helps people and actually you contribute more. It actually helps the tax base more than not. So it's a shame, but I'm really am here for the fight, because I think my experience, I was very lucky to be multifaceted in my ability to make money, and I had to use every single one of my skills to navigate that time. But I know just how much of the people, especially in my community, who are not able to provide for themselves in those times, and how much that relates to the breakdown of their relationships and family. And it's just no longer something that we're willing to stand by.
You mentioned Boris Johnson there and pointed to the culture among our leaders in society. I remember some months ago, it was during the Tory leadership contest, Kemi Badenoch made headlines for apparently saying maternity leave has gone too far. There was outrage from the media, and she said actually she'd been misquoted. And of course, she didn't mean maternity leave had gone too far. She meant business regulation had gone too far. But what was interesting was her rivals in the leadership contest, two men, Robert Jenrick and Tom Tugendhat, they sort of jumped on it and were like, we stand with women and working mums and parents, and we want to be on their side. used that rhetoric, used that bandwagon to try and get ahead in the political race. But did any of them ever proposed any actual policy to stand by, to turn those words into
Well, no,
action?
and I think this is where politics is very reactive at this time, and it doesn't actually lead for what the country actually needs and planning for. We don't have a 5-year strategy for Britain. We have what makes the most noise, what's going to get me political points, and we'll make a view on that to hopefully win votes. And it's just a circus at this time, which is why for me to have a government that at least takes meetings on these issues is really important, regardless of how you feel. We've been able to sit down with quite a lot of MPs who are really passionate about supporting this, develop a strategy about how we get this through short, mid, and long term, and what does it look like in the end. I cannot explain to you how different the culture is. To be able to go into a government and get some sort of answer and accountability. Even their no's are clear as to what it is and why. I just never had that historically. So yes, it is a bit of a circus, and I try not to get lost in the game of just sound bites and going back and forth. I'm so glad to be here to have a really powerful conversation about something that's super important. Also to advocate for men's rights, which sounds bizarre because it's like men have all the rights and the platforms, but not good men. Good men don't have those platforms. We don't have an equivalent to Elon Musk talking about, stay at home and look after your kid. Elon Musk has 13 children and doesn't speak to half of them. So
Apparently
these
14
are
now.
14 and,
Yeah.
and probably a mysterious 15 that we don't know about. So I can't use those men as leverage to anything. Then they don't speak for me, and I have no relationship to anything, including their values.
What you point to just there, I'm so glad you just said that and how you said that. Because a lot of the topics we cover here are really, really heated debates happening, demonizing, targeting minorities, end up being culture wars. But actually what that means at the ground level is that these real day-to-day issues affecting everybody are just not getting dealt with. They're just not a priority in our political climate. So yeah, thank you for just... explaining that like you did.
I want to delve into a very particular headline that we saw recently and get your opinion on it. So this is that last month, the University of Tennessee's women's basketball coach returned to work 1 week after giving birth to her son. Now, this was the subject of much media attention. A headline from The Guardian read, "A college coach returned to work a week after giving birth. Was it too soon?" Articles like this debated her decision, getting the input from health professionals and psychologists on her decision. Now, while the coverage was not necessarily negative, a lot of people were praising her decision to go back to work. Was it asking the right questions or useful questions?
I think the problem that we have with maternity leave in general is that people make assumptions about how you're going to take it. And it seems to be a blanket rule for everyone. So employers, for example, in the UK, tend to think, as a general rule, you're not coming back. And that causes so many problems for employees coming off maternity leave. They just make an assumption that you're probably going to quit, or you're less interested in your job, and you're not going to be as motivated. You don't want the pay rise and the job role and all that kind of thing. With this story in particular, I mean, it's again the same thing. You're making an assumption that this woman doesn't want to return to work. And I think when you dig into the detail of it, she's paid $750,000. So it's not a financial reason. If it was financially that she had to go back to make ends meet, I would potentially say that points to a structural issue. But if it's not that, she's just got a passion for her team, and she wants to carry on seeing them do well, and she feels able to, then I think we should stop trying to prescribe how people should take their maternity leave.
But I think those types of questions are there to encourage a pile-on into someone who's made a powerful decision about their career. The difference between something like coaching, which is a week by week endeavor. Like if Mikel Arteta had a baby himself, and he could have a baby, and then he decided, even WSL managers, Women's Premier League managers, they take the time off, and that's been known that they've taken some time off, but they have to go back to work really, really quickly. They don't get the freedom to take 9 months off in that type of work. And I think that creating false equivalence in environments like that create really negative conversation around mothers, but also it starts looking at, well, who's your partner, and why is he not looking after you? These kind of really draconian ideas start being inserted into conversations where they don't actually belong. I just think it's incredibly problematic from an established platform like that to pose such a question in that way, rather than explore the actual amazing feat of giving birth and going back to work in that context, because they're really passionate, and it shows the duality of what women can be in both ways. Like I like the way my mum raised me is such a fierce defender of the freedom of choice, and the freedom of choice is taken away if you don't have the equity, the financial ability to take the time off or to go back to work at your own choice. If you're forced into a choice, then that's when the problem exists. So we really want to encourage mothers to be flexible in their mental approach of like, how can I go back? Because some people have villages raising their children. Like, I was very fortunate, the mother of my children had about 9 people who were willing to slide on their knees and carry the baby at any point. We were fighting over this child. So in that case, she could have gone back to work earlier under particular arrangements. And I think that should be celebrated. And I think that's where I say the essence of family has been lost, because we don't even consider, and I think that's more of a global south, global north difference. In the global south, your village raises your children with you, and that's just normal. It's not even a question. But I know in Europe and North America, it's kind of like my household is the household, but that's not how it should be. And I think there's a lot of customs that can be transported from Africa, from South Asia, from East Asia, in how we build family, because this current way really isn't working.
Yeah. And you both just listed reasons that sometimes people are forced to go back to work. We don't have those support systems in place, financial pressures. If that was the case here, I could actually see why this was maybe a public interest story, but not in the way that The Guardian asked it. When you read the headline, a college coach returned to work a week after giving birth, the question they ask is, was it too soon? Shouldn't the question have been, why did she have to? If she had to. If she didn't have to, and she just wanted to, then who the hell has the right to an opinion on that? You're right, it is just asking for a pile-up and cueing a really unhelpful type of conversation.
So it does point to something that parents face, though. As soon as you have a kid, everyone has an opinion, and everyone says you're doing it right or wrong. And if you put something on the internet, you're going to be sure that someone's going to say, oh, I wouldn't do that, did you know that's not safe, blah, 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 blah. Like, it's very hard to avoid other people's opinions on that. As you're right, that is a non-story, but everyone feels like they have a right to comment on how other people parent, which is a weird phenomenon.
100%, definitely. Another recent story I want to talk about is that in late January, Ian Murray, the Scottish secretary, made headlines as the first cabinet minister to take full paternity leave. Murray said the biggest impediment to paternity leave is culture, and that from a wider policy perspective, I think it's really important for dads to know that they can take it. What does it say that a policymaker makes headlines by not improving paternity leave, but simply taking it?
It just shows how far we are behind. And I think because of the type of work he does, which again is context, because of the type of work he does, he would be encouraged to go back to work, even if he just had a child in recent times. And that would be really normalized. If he attended back in Parliament 2 days later, it'd be like, oh, good to see you. Nobody would ask, why are you even here? Like you're not needed. Like that, you can actually have a proxy represent you in those particular moments, and changing policies to allow those things to happen and make them normal will go a really long way. And this is where the frustration lies: is you have the societal view, which gets developed over an extended period of time, but it takes so long for the policy shift to actually happen to make it so that it's either mandatory or it's encouraged or actually equitably affordable to do so, that by the time we get there, we end up taking steps backward, and the view starts to change, and the view and the momentum starts to disappear for that change. So it's incredibly important that while we have the attention of the world, we get this paternity change really put into place, and then we start, how do we build upon that? There's a phase 2 to it immediately that needs to be started, so that in 10 years time, my son, when he decides to have children, has a much better view in terms of how we can do it.
Katie, is there anything you want to add to that? You don't have to.
No, I just think it speaks to the, you can see from politicians and the reactions around parenting as a politician has always been like there's always been a friction there. If Keir Starmer in the election is saying that he was going to take every Friday night to spend with his family, people were like, what? With your family every Friday? And it was like, if I can, if there's no, world dramas going on. And people had a very strange reaction to that. So I think it just speaks to being like, again, the context is important. Like being a politician and MP is incredibly difficult, balancing that with a family. You've got like House of Commons hours, which finish at like 10 o'clock at night, and you're not necessarily living in your home, your family home most of the week. And it is difficult to raise a family in that context. I think there's a lot of work to do, particularly for MPs and for Parliament, to make it more family-friendly workplace.
Right, so until we actually make the policy-making space friendly for young parents, we're not going to see policies brought in that are friendly for young parents.
Yeah, and it is quite confusing because government obviously does see the benefit in things like good maternity and paternity leave, because in their civil service they offer typically like really good enhanced policies. So you'll see a lot of like the Department of Justice and the DWP offering like 26 weeks full paid Department of Education, yet their teachers don't have very good enhanced maternity pay. So if they're understanding that it's important in their internal running of their organisation, it's important in terms of a talent acquisition tool, it's important in terms of retention and quality, they see the benefits of it working within their own department, but they're reluctant to roll it out first to wider civil service or public service positions and then greater to more statutory policies, then you can see there's a disconnect there.
To businesses and corporations.
Yes.
who generally don't like governments intervening for things like labour rights and free market. Let them do what they do best, that sort of thing. In the case of this Scottish politician, Ian Murray, his decision, it was partly to promote the Labour Party's new Make Work Pay agenda, which aims to make paternity and parental leave available from day one of starting a new job. Is this a sign of good progress, or is it lip service? Marvyn, why didn't you?
No, I think it is progress, but as I said, I'm not sure how many more people will be aware of that being in place and will actually adopt it. And we spoke earlier about employers not necessarily understanding the laws that are being put in place to even advise people on what's the best practice. So how many people are generally taking it out? We'll only have to know when the figures come out next year. But I think overall, because the culture isn't even to inquire, I wouldn't even think to ask. And actually, I didn't even consider asking. Somebody told me that I should look into shared parental leave and paternity leave. I didn't actually even know the concept exists. I was just mentally prepared to take time off. When I investigated, I was like, this is so bad. It would do me a disservice in mental space trying to find the answers in this than it is just to go back to work and call my village in. And I think constantly trying to find strategies to navigate what just isn't there is a part of the problem. There's a bare minimum that I think a really good government should be able to put in place to encourage these types of environments for people to be present and active at home. And it's not being done. As you said, there are depending on which industry you work in, there are different interpretations of rules and laws that are being put in place. And I think that's the massive problem. The government should just make very clear and make it as universally accessible and easy as possible. They're so worried about leakage and the idea of some sort of benefit fraud that they're not willing just to do what's actually best for the country and put the right things in place. The benefit fraud gets so much news headlines.
Yeah.
Whenever I do a breakfast TV show, it's like people will call in and it's like, if people aren't literally walking through landmines to navigate life, they're like not happy. It's like, oh, well, in my day, we never had anything, so nobody should have anything now. We cannot listen to that part of the electorate. People who are genuinely in their 20s and 30s, who are family planning, as was mentioned earlier, aren't considering families, because the actual logistical nightmare of trying to raise a family in this time, whether it's buying a house, whether it's actually paying for your children, any costs that come associated with it, paternity leave, all those things, is a treacherous environment. It's like nobody wants to navigate that. So we're creating this culture where we will not have families being developed, and we're definitely not going to be able to keep them together if somebody manages to get through the minefield to actually create a family.
Yeah, we have this really low birth rate, aging population, and all those questions. Why aren't people having kids. And you just put your finger on it. Katie, what are your thoughts on this new policy?
I think it is a very complicated system to navigate, and actually the media on this particular change aren't helpful because they spread a lot of disinformation, or they don't understand what the new laws that are being brought in are. So parental leave as a concept from day one to lots of people sounds like statutory maternity pay from day one. That's how I read it. And then it was reported in The Guardian, on the BBC, as you can get maternity pay from day one. That's not what parental leave is. Parental leave is 18 weeks of unpaid time that you can take for your child up until the age that they're 18. It's got nothing to do with maternity leave, paternity leave. It's something completely different. And because it was been so misreported, people were getting really, really confused. We fell for it at Nugget and we did a video on it and it was completely wrong. We had to retract it and it was really embarrassing. But I mean, I checked 3 national newspapers.
Right.
So if that is what we're dealing with, the lack of clarity in this whole space is really a huge problem. And that's what we're here to try and solve, and just try and take complicated ideas with all these different eligibility requirements and make it really, really simple. I completely agree. It's just too difficult to navigate, and the government are more worried about people accessing it who shouldn't be, rather than trying to make it easy to understand and accessible for the people who can.
And from a media storm perspective, something I'm hearing you say is, if there are actually policies there is some progress being made, but it's not being seized because there's no awareness.
Yeah.
People don't know it exists, and even if they do, they don't understand it. And what is the media's job if not that? Just as an exercise, imagine if the mainstream media, all of the articles, all of the coverage that they dedicate to issues like whether trans people can use bathrooms, if they actually dedicated that to explaining, covering policies and laws that actually affect people's lives, how different the situation
I have a
could
very
be.
strong view, but please go.
I was just gonna say on that like if they had taken the time to actually understand what that new law was coming in, they might have a time to actually properly analyse it and put some rebuttal in. I.e., you've introduced paternity leave from day one, but it's got no pay. So how useful is that really to most people? If the biggest problem for people not taking paternity leave is the fact that it pays pennies, now you're saying you can have paternity leave from day one, but we're going to pay nothing. Well, is that lip service? And then what we're missing is that criticism, because they're not analysing the changes coming in enough. So they're not explaining it, and then they're not giving it the proper critique, which is needed to push the change.
Well, a lot of that needs to come from, I think the actual shift of media has come from what we have done with the concept of an opinion. And we've taken opinion from being something that an expert would have based on something that they know, to just anybody in the world can have an opinion. And whoever says it the loudest, funniest, gets platformed equally with somebody with 20 years experience. And so as a result, someone to decipher a government press release on a policy, to actually read it, be able to understand it, and then interpret that into language for everybody else to understand, doesn't actually exist. And you will find a cool blogger who will just quickly take the information and come back with what they think it means, and now we're all being misinformed. I think the other thing is that if you're driving and focusing on ratings, your objective is to get to equally platform two opposing ideas and have them argue for entertainment, rather than to genuinely share ideas about what's best for the country. And as a result, in the last 15 years, I think we've seen some of the worst decision-making in the history of politics be able to go pretty much unchallenged, because we don't have experts. And no one can name me an expert from a particular field to say, this is the person we go to for this type of information. And so it is really, really disheartening and sad that you don't have experts or people with lived experience to communicate these really important ideas. But that's why these environments, these spaces with actual people who do this on a regular basis, sharing their views to guide people into healthy outcomes. And I think that's where platforms like this will probably grow much faster than traditional media platforms.
Yeah. Exactly, couldn't agree with that more. And by the way, that is exactly why we do what we do at Media Storm, where we only invite people whose lives are actually affected by the debate to have the debate.
I just want to stand up and clap.
Yeah.
Let's wrap there.
Is there anything that you wanted to say that we haven't given you the chance to say? Yeah.
Well, like, I just have a message to dads. I think it's incredibly important that you awaken to the idea that you, as you are, is a valuable add to your children's lives, and your family does need you, but not just need you to provide and protect from this sort of imaginary Liam Neeson type danger. It's actually, we need you and your spirit, your values, your consistency, your discipline. We need you. We need masculinity in the world in a healthy way. And I think there's so much going on that could be solved with present men being there, and actually taking a really strong stand against other men who are doing things that are absolutely outside of our values. And I think the more that you are aware and you lean into it, the greater quality of life that you will experience. So I really do hope men awaken to the challenge of parenting on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. And Katie, is there anything that you want to leave listeners with?
Just that you might come away from this conversation thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do it? And it seems like an unsurmountable task. But if you think you want to have children in the future, you can make it happen. It just requires planning and it requires knowledge. So you just need to start saving, both you and your partner, if you have one, and make a plan. Be aware of what your employer's policy is for maternity or paternity leave. Don't be afraid to negotiate it. You're actually in the strongest position to negotiate your maternity package when you're not even pregnant, because it looks like you have less skin in the game. And that's something that we've had massive success with in Nugget, and we've had people go from statutory to like 3 or 4 months full pay, and that's the difference of, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of pounds. So don't be afraid to do that. Make sure that you know your rights. Make sure that you're aware of what happens to your pension, your student loan when you're on leave, and just talk to your partner about how you're both going to mitigate that and how you're both going to make sure that if one person takes a longer leave, that person isn't financially negative as a result, and try and work as a team.
Thank you so much. Marvyn and Katie, thank you so much for joining us on
Thank
Media
you.
Storm. Just tell us quickly, where can people follow you and your work online?
You can find me at .blackdads anywhere, or at Marvyn Harrison anywhere also.
And Katie?
And we are on at Nugget Savings across TikTok and Instagram.
Amazing. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.